And welcome to the Liberty and Poverty panel. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Noelle Norton, today. But before we start, I want to let you know that we're going to have a Q&A session following the sessions with Noelle. And then afterwards, you can talk to the authors and purchase their books and get your book signed. So yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Noelle.
Hi, thank you. Welcome to the Liberty and Poverty panel. In addition to being the Dean of Arts and Sciences at USD, I'm also a political scientist, so I'm very excited about this panel. And I thank the Humanities Center Director, Brian Clark, for allowing me to be the moderator today. So we're going to be talking with Miranda Perry Fleischer, who is the Richard and Kay Waltman Professor in our School of Law, and Matt Zwolinski, who is a professor in the Department of Philosophy. They also have quite a few other things behind them, but I think for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into the details other than to say they're quite accomplished, both university professors here at USD. And that is an award that is granted to people who have excellent research and excellent teaching, both. And so these are the 2021 university professor and the 2022 university professor. So you're in excellent company. The book that they wrote together, Universal Basic Income, What Everybody Needs to Know, this is their co-authored work. We're going to talk about that one first. This was supposed to be out by Oxford University Press in July, but as many books that come, fresh and hot off the press, they don't come as fast as you want them. So we know it's August, but they have a flyer and a discount code that you can use if you want to buy the book. And then the other book we're going to talk about is a book that Matt Zwolinski co-authored with his John Tomasi, called The Individualists, Radicals, Reactionaries, and the Struggle for the Soul, excuse me, of Libertarianism. So let me just jump into the questions. 20 minutes of questions, and then we will let you ask some questions. I'm going to ask the most important question to both of you. What is a universal basic income? Some people may not know. What is it and where did the idea come from? And I don't care.
Well, I'll start with what it is. So it's a radically simple idea. The idea is that everyone just gets a set sum of cash, no questions asked, no strings attached at regular intervals. And it's universal in the sense that it's paid to young and old. It's paid whether you're working or whether you're not, whether you're disabled, no matter where you live, whether you have a drug conviction or not. It's not exactly universal because even though it looks like maybe everyone would get it, all of us in here and super rich people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, once you get into the funding, which we can talk about a little bit later, wealthy people on net wouldn't actually benefit it. So in that sense, the universal is a little bit misleading. It's been around a long time. Matt can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the idea has gotten a lot of attention in the last 10 years or so. I started thinking and working about this idea 10 years or so ago. Really picked up in 2016 when Andrew Yang made the universal basic income the centerpiece of his campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination. But the idea has actually been around for several hundred years. Thomas Paine, one of the founding fathers of the United States, set forth something very much like a universal basic income, a little pamphlet called Agrarian Justice. And it's kind of come and gone since the 18th century. You've seen people over the course of the 20th century from all over the political spectrum, which is one of the interesting things about the UBI. So you have people like Martin Luther King advocating a UBI as the simplest solution for poverty. On the other hand, you have people like Milton Friedman, who actually proposed something called a negative income tax, which sort of looks a little bit different from a UBI, but essentially amounts to the same thing, and which actually came very, very close to becoming law in the United States under the presidency of Richard Nixon, under something called the Family Assistance Plan, which I'd say we can talk about, but we probably don't have time. It's coming. It's been around for a long time, come and gone, but it's really seeming to undergo a resurgence of popularity in the last 5 years.
So you're talking about how certain thinkers advocated for it. We almost signed it. Has it ever been tried anywhere?
Sort of, kind of.
Yes.
So there's no country
Okay.
that has instituted anything like a permanent, fully universal basic income. So we don't have that to look at, but we do have a lot of experience with cash transfers, which is kind of the core of a basic income, right? You're giving people cash that they could do whatever they want with. Some of those cash transfers have taken the form of conditional transfers that different countries have set up. So you have a program called Oportunidades in Mexico. That's a conditional cash transfer. You have something called Bolsa Familia in Brazil, which is fairly similar. You have things like Alaska takes a portion of its oil revenues and distributes those to its population. It's called the permanent fund dividend. That's kind of like a basic income, although the amount is relatively low. It only amounts to something like $1,600 on average per year, whereas most basic income proposals are talking about something more like $500 or $1,000 a month that would be given to people. There have been a lot of pilot programs, tests of the idea of a basic income, ranging back to the 1970s. The U.S. did a number of experiments on the negative income tax. Now, there are about 40 or 50 pilot programs going on in different cities across the United States. The first biggest one of those was in Stockton, California, which some of you might have heard about, but they're all over the place now. Los Angeles has a big one going on. Chicago has a big one going on. There's an organization called Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, which is organizing these things. So if you want to find out more, you can go to their website and look to see what's happening.
There are also a lot of experiments ongoing in Africa and other areas of the developing world. So several countries in Africa, also India has some. So a lot of what we know about how people react to unconditional cash payments, we know from these experiments in Africa and also some of the experiments and pilot programs that Matt has mentioned.
So one thing that people say when they hear about this, and I'm curious about what you say or what you say in your book, I mean, do you think this would really work? You seem to think so. Wouldn't it be too expensive? How can we be sure people aren't wasting their money?
Yeah. So there are really two parts to that, would this work question or not. The first is, would it work in the sense of making people's lives better? And we know from these experiments, and we also know from how people already spend cash that they get through various programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, which some of you may know was expanded temporarily in the summer of 2021. We know that when you give people cash, it benefits them, which also tells us that people by and large aren't wasting them. So when you give families with cash, for example, test scores go up, children stay in school longer, disciplinary incidents in school decrease, children of families that have gotten these cash transfers have later rates of incarceration, lower rates of incarceration as adults, higher incomes when they are adults also. Studies show that people tend not to increase and in fact often decrease spending on goods like alcohol and gambling and drugs. So giving people cash has real benefits. And Columbia University, for example, estimated that for every dollar we spent on just the child tax credit, the returns to society from these improvements would be $8. So that's a 1 to 8 payoff. So in that sense, giving cash to people works. They don't waste it, they use it well, they don't drop out of the workforce en masse. The bigger question is, would it work fiscally? One of the most prominent conservative supporters of a universal basic income, Charles Murray, has suggested that we could just cut all existing welfare programs, replace it with a UBI, and we wouldn't have to raise taxes at all. That is probably a bit unrealistic, and in that sense, it wouldn't work. Some very liberal supporters think that we could just keep all of our current welfare programs and on top of it, give everybody a UBI of $500 or $1,000 a month. That's also unrealistic because that would cost over $1 trillion and you'd have to raise taxes to the level we see in Nordic countries to do that. Something like a $500 a month UBI, if we also cut and consolidated programs like food stamps and Section 8 housing vouchers and took out all the various complicated tax credits and imposed a little surcharge on income. Something like that could work fiscally. Okay. So those are the two questions people usually have when they think of would it work.
Anything to add to that, Matt?
No, just to amplify the first part of her response. Like, we have the shocking finding of decades of scientific research is that poor people, when you give them money, it helps them.
Do you know, I've been reading that as the dawn of the AI revolution coming upon us, we're going to have a lot of people who may not be able to complete the work that they used to complete in the past. Do you see this as a solution to a revolution in employment that we might be facing?
I think potentially, and I think one reason the UBI has captured a lot of people's attention recently is because of this fear that the robots are going to take all the jobs. But I think where Matt and I are coming from, and my position has always been, if you can make the harder case that a UBI has benefits even if the robots don't take all the jobs, then you've made the easier case. And I think another point is that there's an aspect of the UBI, well, people aren't going to work, then they're just going to quit their jobs and surf all day. But what a UBI also does is it allows people to engage in work that's outside the traditional labor market.
Mm-hmm.
So people who are staying home to take care of their children, people who are staying home to take care of elderly parents or engage in volunteer work, or who would like to quit a job that's not working for them so that they can retrain and do something else or start their own business. And we have evidence from the increased unemployment benefits that we got right after COVID that a lot of times when you give people cash, a lot of times they use it to try to retrain or to buy work clothes or pay for car repairs so that they can work. So I think it can also help us expand, if the robots do take what we think of right now as paid employment, the kinds of activities that allow people to live meaningful, fulfilling lives.
Yeah, one of the surprising findings from a lot of these pilot programs that have been run, and it was surprising the first time I saw it, but then I saw it over and over again in different contexts and different pilots, is that when you institute these cash transfer programs, employment actually goes up, which is sort of the opposite of what a lot of economists predicted, which is if you're giving people cash for not working, then why bother working, right? But in struggling to make sense of this, one of the things that people discovered was that, well, look, if you're desperately poor, it's often hard to work because it takes money to work. It takes money to find somebody to take care of your kids. It takes money to maybe get the training that's necessary to obtain the occupational license for different jobs. So there's a real trap there that a lot of people are stuck in. And by providing a little bit of financial assistance, we can help get people out of that trap and get them into paid employment if that's what they want to do with it.
And another aspect of this is people tend to think of, well, what would a universal basic income do to work incentives in a vacuum? And as I mentioned before, most likely something like a universal basic income would replace a lot of existing welfare programs. And some of you may or may not know that many welfare programs have very, very steep phase outs. So just this is an example, you might earn an extra $1, but you could lose up to 50 cents of welfare benefits. That's equivalent to a 50-cent tax. A well-designed UBI can minimize those disincentives, and your net benefit from a UBI would go down much more gently as your income increases. So compared to the current system, we think a UBI could actually increase incentives to work.
Okay, thank you. Both of you describe yourselves as libertarians, but as I listen to you talk, UBIs don't sound that libertarian. It doesn't sound like that kind of policy. How do you explain the inconsistency that many of us may see there or feel there?
Well, I'll start and then I'll pass it over to Matt. I think there are two different ways that libertarians, broadly speaking, and Matt will talk about how broad that is in a second, feel about a UBI. Some, like Milton Friedman, sort of begrudgingly accept, well, we wish there wasn't a world without government-funded redistribution. But if we have to suffer through it, a UBI is better than the current system we have, because the current system is paternalistic and infantilizing and inefficient, and a UBI would be a lot better. And then there's a whole group of libertarians, and Matt and I would put ourselves in this, that do think there's some basis in libertarian theory for saying that we do have a duty to provide a safety net to the very poorest. And Matt can expand on that part.
Yeah, that's right. Libertarianism means a lot of different things. Is enough to write a 450-page book about. But the core idea is really, you can narrow it down to two things, right? There's kind of skepticism of government authority. Libertarians are worried that governments aren't very effective at achieving their desired goals. And they aren't always necessarily trying to achieve desirable goals when they're captured by special interests. There's a skepticism of government power, and there's a corresponding confidence or faith in free individuals to organize themselves as individuals, as communities, as churches, as civic organizations. And so the way in which that leads to a basic income is you have a relatively simple government program. Basic income is a much less bureaucratic form of social welfare program than Section 8 housing or food stamps and all the various different requirements that we impose upon people in order to receive assistance under those programs. That allows individuals a maximal degree of freedom in how to use that benefit for their own advantage, right? So if you get a basic income, that's yours to do with what you want. If you need to pay your electric bill, you can pay your electric bill with it. You can pay your rent with it. You can pay an overdue cell phone bill. You can save it for the future if you don't need to spend it right now. So that corresponds with this kind of libertarian faith that like individuals know their own circumstances, their own lives, their own needs better than other people do, certainly better than some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. does. And if you just provide them with the resources, they can utilize that knowledge to advance their ends more effectively.
Well, I think we've nicely transitioned into your book, Matt. And so just talk to us a bit more about the diverse ideology behind libertarianism, and even go further, elaborate further on why it shouldn't be considered a right-wing ideology.
Yeah. So I mean, so I've been interested in libertarian thought for longer than I've been interested in basic income, probably 20 or 30 years. And it's often perceived as a kind of a weird, kind of kooky species of right-wing ideology. There's an old quip that goes, libertarians are just Republicans who like to smoke dope. So there's something to that, I guess, right? If you look at most of the major libertarian intellectuals over the course of the 20th century, people like Milton Friedman, for instance, people like Friedrich Hayek, people like Ayn Rand. There's a significant amount of overlap there between what the libertarians are saying and doing and what was going on in kind of mainstream conservative, right-wing, Republican think tanks, political organizations. They were publishing in a lot of the same journals. They were saying a lot of the same things. So it's natural to see these two as at least kind of common bedfellows, if not part of the same ideological family. But what we do in this book is we look back a little further. It's a history of libertarian thought. And what we do is we trace libertarianism back to what we see as its origins in the middle of the 19th century. And if you look at what libertarianism was in the 19th century, it's very, very, very different from the caricature that we see of it looking at it today. So for instance, libertarianism in the middle of the 19th century, we're at the forefront of causes like anti-imperialism, women's rights. Libertarians were radical feminists in the early days. Libertarians were at the forefront of the abolitionist movement in the United States. A host of what we now would identify as progressive causes were ones that libertarians were at least committed to, if not kind of taking the lead in advocating for. So something changed. Something changed between the 19th century version of libertarianism. There were libertarians in the 19th century who identified themselves as socialists and didn't think there was any incompatibility between libertarianism and socialists. Like, what changed between 19th century libertarians like Frederick Basquiat, Benjamin Tucker, and then 20th century libertarians like Friedman, Hayek, von Mises, etc.? The argument that we make is what changed is socialism. So what socialism meant in the 19th century, when you had American libertarians like Benjamin Tucker and Lysander Spooner saying, yeah, I see nothing wrong with socialism. What socialism meant was kind of voluntary, small-scale, cooperative community. You didn't have, in 19th century America, socialists existing as a revolutionary force that were seeking to control the state and seize ownership of the means of production and radically transform society. Socialists wanted to kind of go off in the countryside, set up their own communities, and like try stuff out. And libertarians looked at that and said, fine, like go live your life, right? Try out new ideas as long as you're peaceful, right? As long as you're not trying to force other people to live in a way they don't want to live. There's nothing wrong with that. By the 20th century, though, right, after the Russian Revolution, after socialism became a kind of militarist, international expansionist force, libertarians looked at socialism in a very different way and thought, this is not just a threat to liberty, it's in fact the central threat to liberty. This is, in a sense, what it means to be unfree is to live under a socialist state. And so they began to define their own worldview in opposition to, in reaction to the perceived threat of state socialism. And that just came to dominate libertarian ideology in a way that it didn't in the 19th century. And all that other stuff that libertarians used to care about, right? Anti-imperialism, women's rights, right? The rights of religious minorities, all of that stuff got kind of pushed to the side. And libertarians came to make common cause with conservatives in the United States and to a lesser extent in Europe as well, in opposition to international socialism and opposition to what they perceived as the kind of looming threat of creeping socialism at home. So a lot of libertarians sort of got their first, sort of hopped into bed with conservatives for the first time around the 1930s when they looked at FDR and thought, like, this guy's trying to impose socialism in the United States. We need to, like, we can't give an inch, right? We can't give 1 inch to this or else, right? This is where we're going. It's the gulag. So that's I think the seed of the truth that libertarianism is a right-wing ideology. And now, 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, libertarianism is in this kind of crisis of identity where, we don't have socialism against which to define ourselves anymore. So, like, where are we? How do we stand in the current political arena? What's our stand with conservatives now when conservatism looks more populist, right, than anti-socialist?
That's fascinating. Maybe this is a dumb question, but when did the term libertarian start to be used to identify this set of ideas?
Yeah, not a dumb question at all. So the term libertarian is an older one, but originally it didn't have anything to do with politics at all. It was a metaphysical term. So if you were a libertarian, it meant you believed in free will, right? So you think people are free in this kind of deep metaphysical sense. The political sense of the term libertarianism didn't emerge to the late 19th century. So a lot of people who we identify in this book as early libertarians didn't call themselves that. They called themselves individualists, hence the title of the book. The first person to call himself a libertarian in the political sense was actually a French anarcho-socialist, right? And it only later came to be kind of appropriated by what we would call a more kind of right-wing or free market libertarian. So it's a contested term, like a lot of political terms, like liberal. People kind of use the term as an epithet in some cases. In some cases, they sort of try to take it back from an enemy group that seized it from them. But it was around 1870, 1880 that the term first started coming to popular use.
Okay. I'm going to ask you one more question before I turn it over to the audience, because I want you to have 15 minutes of time to ask questions. My question is, how do your students, law students and philosophy or philosophy, politics, and economics students, how do they react to UBI and or to libertarianism when you talk about it? Are they shocked? Any comments on that?
I think a lot of law students are really interested in the idea. I mean, a lot of law students go to law school because they want to change the world. And this is an idea that I don't know that it could change the world the way that some of its proponents say that it's going to just get rid of poverty completely, get rid of inequality completely. But a lot of them are really captured by the idea. And then one thing that I enjoy in my classes is sort of getting them to see that the world is a nuanced place. So UBI, there are some pros, but there are some cons. Current welfare system, some pros, some cons. Tax system as a whole, some pros and some cons. And so UBI really encapsulates that idea.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I always have this fear in the classroom when I'm talking about ideas that I care a lot about, that students are just going to agree with me because I'm the professor, right? And they think that their grade depends on it. So I sort of bend over backwards in a way to point out the weak sides of ideas that I'm attracted to, like, because I know the counter arguments really well, right? Because I've been hearing them all my life. So I try to push them, right? The ones that are attracted to a libertarianism, I say well, what about this? What about that? And the same with the universal basic income. But these are both, I guess, weird ideas, right? They're out of the political mainstream, and so I think that's exciting for students to hear about those kinds of ideas. To think about them. It's different from what they're used to, different from what they're taught from their parents. And I think if you do that in a kind of open, exploratory way, right? Like, here's something that's kind of cool and interesting to think about, not like this is what you must believe. My experience is students respond really positively.
Okay, thank you both. Let's see if you have any questions about these weird ideas. I see your hand up first, and then we'll go over this to this side. I'll go back and forth. That's what I'll do. So go ahead. And speak up very loudly.
I'm very naive to all of this, so I apologize if my question's a little weird or off or whatever. But large national retailers are accused of structuring their workforce such that welfare systems subsidize the cost of having employees. How do you see UBI playing out in that context?
So the way that we envision UBI, I think, is as a replacement for a lot of current welfare systems. So I haven't looked at the data on this accusation recently. I feel like the last time that I looked into it, there are a lot of reasons to think that due to market forces and market competition, that's less true than it might appear. One thing to point out is that the current system requires people to work often to get their benefits. And so you can imagine that if these accusations were true, a system that says you have to have a job to get benefits, the employers could say, oh, well, these people need to work to get their benefits. They'll take whatever we give them.
Right.
But one thing a UBI does is it gives people the power to say no to a bad job, to say no to an abusive spouse or whatever. So if an employer wasn't, treating them well or not paying them enough, they would have more power to leave and go work somewhere else.
One proponent, I think, called the UBI a permanent strike fund.
Yeah.
Essentially, right? I mean, you've got something to fall back on, which means that you don't necessarily have to take whatever option is presented to you, right? So the bigger question, how the wages of workers are determined and what relationship that bears to various government subsidy programs, I think it's a complicated one. There's a lot of economic literature on this.
Yeah. I haven't looked at it in a couple years. My instinct would be that a lot depends on the local labor market where you are. So if there's only one employer, that employer is going to have a lot more power. Just like if there's only one grocery store, they might be able to raise prices in response to a UBI. But if you're in a place where labor is free, labor can just drive 10 minutes to the next town, and where your dollars are free, you could go spend your dollars at the grocery store 10 minutes away also. Both the employment effects and any potential inflationary effects would be minimized.
Okay. I saw the woman in pink, and then I'll go over here, and then I'll come back to you, Turner, and then
She
Harry.
addressed it a little bit at the end. My question is, the events and the situations you've already discussed and studied were small populations. So if this were to go across the whole United States, that's a large population, if everybody's getting it, doesn't that inflate what we have? Doesn't that lower the value of the money that people are getting?
Okay, that's a great question, and that's a common fear. So first off, for a big chunk of the population, we're just repackaging funds that we're already giving them. And right now, a lot of those funds are trapped in ways that we could see inflation decrease. So right now, for example, if you get food stamps, you could only spend them on food. You can't spend them on diapers. You can't even spend your food stamps on hot food, like someone who's just worked 12 hours at McDonald's and wants to buy a healthier roast chicken at Vons on the way home for $8. They have to buy a raw chicken and then go spend an hour roasting the raw chicken. I can buy the $8 chicken, but someone who's already worked 12 hours. So by giving people cash instead of limiting them, that frees up competition. Food sellers can't just jack up prices in response to that. At the higher end, we would probably have to raise taxes somewhat if we were going to fund a $500 a month UBI to everyone, maybe 7%. So upper income people might see their after-tax incomes decrease some, and that would offset inflation. Now, if we paid for a UBI just by printing money, yes, that could have inflationary effects. This goes to the would it work question. But assuming that we pay for it through some combination of higher taxes and cutting and consolidating existing government programs, it should have minimal effects. And I think evidence from from Alaska shows minimal effects. Other places do. It could be if there's a small mountain town with only one retailer such that there's a monopoly, prices could go up there. And some evidence in Mexico and Brazil shows that. But most places where money can sort of flow out and there's competition, there aren't real inflationary effects.
I mean, it's all about the funding, like Miranda says, right? So if all you're doing is reshuffling money around the economy, and you're not increasing net demand, and so there shouldn't be any inflation as a result. But if you're printing money, or if you're borrowing money, right, then you are leading to a net increase in demand, and that's going to generate inflation. But you're absolutely right about sort of the difference between the small scale and the large scale, right? All the pilot programs that we've run have been on a relatively small scale. And there are effects of a basic income, both positive and negative effects of a basic income, that you just wouldn't expect to occur on that small scale, but you would expect to emerge on a much larger scale, both in terms of number of people covered and the time horizon of this project. These pilot programs are limited in terms of 1 or 2 years. So that's something we talk about a bit in the book. Which I should say, by the way, although both of us, not that one, the other one, the one you can't, this book, right, that you don't have yet.
The one with the discount.
Yes, the flyer.
Yeah.
We'll sign the flyer if you want.
Both of us are supporters of a basic income, but the book isn't a manifesto. There are a lot of manifestos out there on like why the basic income is going to cure all the problems of society. We didn't think that another book like that needed to be written. So the book we wrote it's a guide to the basic income. We try to make it as an objective a guide as possible, right? Like here are the different forms a basic income could take. Here are the different questions you have to ask about the details of the policy, because really the devil's in the details when it comes to a UBI. Here are the advantages of doing it this way. Here are the costs of doing it that way. Make up your own mind. We're not trying to shove a particular version or any version of the basic income down readers' throat. It's just, if you want to be an intelligently informed layperson about this policy program, here's a good book for you.
It's good to know. I see the woman in the, no, actually, it's you, Jenny. I didn't want the audience to say, I know everybody's name in here, because I'm going to turn her next.
Thank you so much for this book. I'm really interested to read, especially about UBI. It's been a really interesting concept for me. I was wondering, so you were sort of talking about if we have UBI, some things have to go, like Section 8 or housing. I was wondering what you had to say about healthcare and whether or not UBI is compatible with universal healthcare. Because I know like $500 a month would be great for like cars and electricity, but healthcare costs is nothing, especially if you're a person who doesn't work, if it's a disability. Like this is just not going to be good enough to do the things I think we all want UBI to do.
Yeah.
So if we have any like guidance or suggestions on that.
So your question points to something that Matt just mentioned, which is there are a lot of different UBI plans out there and they would do lots of different things. So Charles Murray, one of the conservative UBI supporters we mentioned, he would also cut publicly funded healthcare and have people responsible, I think, for their own healthcare. I tend to, that's unrealistic. That just wouldn't happen politically. So there are certain tax expenditures for healthcare, like right now the tax system subsidizes a portion of the population to get employer-provided healthcare. I think that's something that should go for other reasons, but I'd love to get a few $100 million to pay for a UBI by getting rid of that, for example. But healthcare is something that I think should still stick around. And Matt said there are a lot of manifestos. One problem with a lot of these manifestos and plans is they're very vague. Like Andrew Yang and Andy Stern, who's a labor leader, they both have plans that say, well, we'll just cut. There are 130 different welfare programs that we'll cut to pay for UBI. And they don't say what those are. So people have questions like yours all the time. What are we going to do about Social Security? These are the tough questions. To a lot of people, UBI sounds good in theory, until you start getting down into those questions. And these are the trade-offs that we address in the book.
Yeah, so for a lot of goods like food and housing, automobiles, clothes, right? We have markets that work fairly well in producing and allocating those goods. Healthcare markets in the United States are just a mess. Nobody on any point in the ideological spectrum looks at the U.S. healthcare system and says, like, that is exactly what I want, right? We don't know what anything costs. Nobody knows what anything costs in health. So it's not like if we gave you cash, it would be easy for you to kind of use that cash effectively to buy the medical services you need. So I think there are a lot of very good reasons for treating healthcare as special and not something that could be addressed by a cash grant in the way that a lot of other stuff could. Housing, on the other hand, I'd much rather have cash than a Section 8 voucher, especially if I'm going to have to wait 10 years for a Section 8 voucher. The waiting
list in San Diego is 10 years. So a lot of these programs, people think, well, if you're going to cut program A, you're going to hurt the poor because you're cutting these programs. But very few poor people are able to take advantage of Section 8. And the way that these programs are structured right now, they're so confusing. It's hard for people to take advantage of them. The Earned Income Tax Credit has a 58-page booklet explaining all of it. to get disability benefits, people often have to hire lawyers. There's this whole cottage industry. So right now, most of the people that are able to convince the system that they can't work are the ones who are actually the best able to navigate the system.
That's true.
Turner, and then I see more people over here. Oh, okay, we've got only a few more minutes, so maybe
We're not
Turner,
going.
Lightning
this
round.
woman, this man. Yeah.
My question is about the relationship between the two books, particularly about the theoretical justification of a universal basic income within the framework of libertarianism. You were already asked about it somewhat, but I'm wondering how a UBI can be justified from basic libertarian principles, and whether it can't really, is the only justification the sort of the begrudging one that you mentioned, where, well, if we have to have government redistribution, this is the best form of it, or is there a principled justification of the taxation that a UBI would require?
I'm not the philosophy professor.
In a libertarian framework, because it seems like it has to work on taxation, but that's supposed to be what libertarians are against.
Yeah. Great question. One that's kind of hard to answer in a short snippet, but there are different approaches that libertarians have taken to this. One of, I think, the most persuasive takes the following form, right? So a lot of libertarians base their whole political ideology on the notion of property, right? So libertarians believe that individuals own themselves, and that they therefore, because they own themselves, they own what they create through their labor. So if you go out and you work and you earn some money as a result of your labor, it would be unjust, it would be theft for the government to come and take that. And there's a certain kind of logic and compelling nature to that story, but it doesn't work very well when what you're talking about are goods that are not created by anybody's labor. That is to say, when you're talking about natural resources like the land, right? Nobody created the land. Nobody created the mineral or oil reserves that are underneath the land. So for you to say that I own this land and I own everything that's produced with this land because I got there first and I put a fence around it, doesn't have that same compelling logic to it that some of the other libertarian arguments have. And so some theorists have looked at that and said, well, okay, well there's the basis on which we can form a legitimate libertarian taxation, because if we tax the value of your land, we're not taking anything that you created, we're taking something that properly belongs to all of humanity, and that can form the basis of a universal. Short answer to a very
Let's try to squeeze two more in. This woman and then this man, both in
I
blue.
never heard of libertarians described as Republicans, even with pot. And I know Republicans don't believe that rich people ought to pay any taxes, because I think we have enough billionaires in the United States that you could take small chunks out of all of them to pay for this. And you don't talk a lot about paying for this.
We do in the book.
Yeah, we do in the book.
Yeah, we haven't really today.
Well,
I
today you
suppose,
have it,
but-
okay.
Yeah, I mean, we would pay for part of it by consolidating a lot of programs. And then I wrote a law review article with a co-author who's now at NYU, he was at the University of Chicago, where we went into a lot more detail about funding. We think that you could pay everyone a $500 a month UBI paid to kids and paid to adults, consolidate a lot of cash transfer programs, and impose a surtax of about 7% on across the board on everyone's income. For me, all the way up to Bill Gates. And 7% would still, it's doable. We don't think it would have very negative incentive effects at the top. It would keep us still far below the levels of taxation that we see in Nordic countries. So there are also a lot of
Republicans would never go for it, even with pot.
You never know. We're holding out hope.
Last question, and I know Harriet, you had one back there. And maybe anybody who wants to go over to the book signing,
We're happy to.
they will talk with you over there. As you buy books, they'll sign and chat and answer questions.
Yeah, it seems to me that most of the difficulty with UBI is the political one of getting the politicians to agree to change all the other programs in a fair way. And I don't think it will be done decently any more than most of the tax fine print is done equally.
Huge
Yes,
challenge.
it is a huge challenge, but I don't know if you have kids or not, but you always teach them to sort of aim high. And if they miss a little bit, at least they've gotten pretty good. So if what comes out of the interest in the UBI are improvements to a lot of the systems that we currently have, like improvements to the earned income the earned income tax credit, or improvements to the child tax credit and to other welfare benefits, I would still consider that a win. So even if UBI itself doesn't get implemented, if some of the ideas gain broader acceptance, I'd be happy with that.
Yeah, there's two big kind of strategic approaches you could take to a universal basic income, right? The first is to push for the pure vision of a UBI that replaces some swath of other programs, right? Like Andrew Yang was doing during his campaign. That's one approach. The other approach is the kind of piecemeal approach, right? Which is we tinker with the existing system and we try to we're not going to replace everything, but we'll take Section 8 and food stamps and we'll turn those into cash programs, right? So we're moving in the direction of a UBI, even if we're not going 100%. I'm not a strategist, I'm a philosopher, so I have no real special insight as to which of those approaches is better. I think realistically, you're more likely to see the piecemeal reforms than you are the big leap, but the big leap is inspiring to people in a way that piecemeal tinkering isn't. So, and a lot of the big changes that we've had in the United States in terms of public policy have been big changes that have resulted from people pushing something radically different from the status quo. So.
I think this is a perfect spot to end. I'm going to have you come up and ask them.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect spot to end. And I want to say thank you to both of the authors and co-authors. The book flyers out there, here's the book. I'm excited about reading them. So I had fun at this panel. I learned a lot. So thank you.
Thank you.
Come on up.
Yeah.